They'd built flaming torches along my private shoreline. I was certain I was hallucinating. See, I'd just come back from a late business trip in Charleston, tired and sweaty, ready to collapse on my couch. Yet when I turned onto the gravel lane leading to my property, I saw the warm glow of tiki lights dancing against the night sky. My first stunned thought was, who's throwing a party on my land? But it wasn't just a few folks on the beach. The entire lake area was transformed into a Hawaiian-themed extravaganza. Bamboo bars, faux palm trees, and a row of bright paper lanterns leading right across what was unmistakably my private property line. A thrumming beat of island-style music echoed across the water, and the aroma of roast pork or some marinade wafted through the air. I practically slammed the brakes, heart hammering. I live in the outskirts of Evergreen Springs, a smallish town in central Georgia. My property includes a decent chunk of land that was once part of a large estate owned by my grandfather. Over time, different family members sold off their shares, but an interesting twist of fate and some strategic real estate deals I'd made over the years meant that, quietly, I ended up holding deeds for a major portion of the county, especially the lake region. I never broadcast that information, I just liked my privacy. I hopped out of my truck, stared at the flickering lights reflected off the water, and decided it was no time to be timid. Marching forward, I heard laughter and the clink of drink glasses. The moment I stepped onto the sand, a short woman in a grass skirt and a plastic lei around her neck approached. "Aloha," she chirped. Then she frowned, as if realizing I didn't belong. "Are you from Lakecrest HOA?" Lakecrest HOA? They'd tried to buy a piece of my lakefront last year, something about building a community dock. I told them no. They demanded a meeting, threatened me with easements, but they backed off eventually, or so I thought. Now it seemed they'd decided to ignore me altogether. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But who gave you permission to set all this up here?" The woman blinked, confusion etched on her face. Miss Connolly said it was all arranged. She's the HOA president. She told us the club had full access for our luau." A flare of anger pulsed through my veins. Miss Connolly, this short, impeccably dressed woman in her 40s, was known in town for her manipulative ways. She once tried to fine a neighbor for painting his shutters a slightly off blue color from the approved palette. She'd somehow grown Lakecrest HOA into a mini kingdom of rules, fees, and twisted logic. But using my lake for a luau? That was an audacity I never anticipated. I stepped past the greeter, heading toward the bonfires crackling by the shoreline. A crowd of at least 50 people milled about, many wearing leis or straw hats, sipping cocktails out of coconut-shaped cups. Some folks splashed in the shallow water, others reclined on deck chairs as if they owned the place. I even spotted a small stage with steel drum musicians playing pseudo-Hawaiian tunes. The entire scene was surreal. Suddenly I heard a sharp voice from behind me. "Hey, you can't be over here without a wristband." I turned to see a tall, lanky man with a Lakecrest security t-shirt. My eyes narrowed. "I don't need a wristband," I replied quietly, "because this is my property." He gave a startled laugh. "Your property? Nah, buddy. Miss Conley said we have full rights. This is an official HOA event." I let out a slow breath. "My name is Joshua Pierce. I'm pushing 40 and have spent most of my adult life building a financial consulting company that allowed me to invest heavily in local real estate. The memory of my grandfather's small orchard and farmland still resonates with me, so I've always felt protective of this land." Ms. Connolly apparently was about to learn that the local rumor Joshua Pierce owns half the county was a severe underestimate. I excused myself from the confrontation with the security guard, deciding I needed to find Ms. Connolly in person. The music's volume escalated near a large, tiki-style hut set up on the lakeshore. Striped paper lanterns cast shifting light on a makeshift dance floor. And there she was. Miss Connolly in a floral dress, a bright pink lei looped around her neck, clapping politely as a group of dancers in grass skirts performed. I marched right up, ignoring the stares from a few bystanders. Miss Conley spotted me, and for a split second I saw her expression falter. but then her practiced, condescending smile slipped into place. "Mr. Pierce, I heard you were out of town. Lovely surprise to see you," she said with forced cheer. "Mind telling me why you're trespassing on my lake?" I replied, voice low. A hush fell over the immediate group of onlookers. Ms. Connolly waved a hand dismissively. "We're not trespassing. Lakecrest HOA has a long-standing arrangement for this part of the shoreline. The county records show it's within our extended boundary." I nearly laughed out loud. "Extended boundary? I specifically told you last year that I owned all this lakefront. I refused your request to buy or lease it. Now I come home to find you throwing a massive luau?" Ms. Connolly's eyes darted around looking for backup. A couple of her board members in Hawaiian shirts sidled up, trying to look intimidating. The truth was, my ownership of the land wasn't just a rumor. I had all the deeds, the official titles, the historic records from my grandfather's time, everything proving that the entire lake was on property belonging to me or shell companies I control. Ms. Connolly, however, had tried to claim some obscure right from an outdated county map that was never approved, and apparently she decided to just take what she wanted. She feigned composure. "Well, if there's a misunderstanding, we can talk about it tomorrow. Right now we have families enjoying themselves. We've scheduled this event for months. It's a major fundraiser, Mr. Pierce. Don't cause a scene." I felt my jaw tighten. Don't cause a scene? They'd cause a flaming spectacle on my land. But I also recognized that shutting down a party with kids and families in the middle of the night could backfire. The last thing I wanted was a big blow-up that might scare children or cause chaos, so I forced a grim smile. "Fine. You can finish your luau, but tomorrow, Miss Connolly, you and I are having a serious conversation." A hint of triumph sparkled in her eyes. "That's quite generous, Mr. Pierce. I'm sure we'll reach an understanding." And with that, she turned to greet a pair of older residents carrying trays of fruit skewers, leaving me standing there seething. I took a moment to watch the spectacle: floating torches, clumsy hula dancing, the distinct smell of roasted pineapple. All these folks had no clue they were partying on property that wasn't covered by the HOA's domain. I resolved not to cause a public scene, but inside, a plan simmered. My father always taught me never to let bullies think they've won, but also never to lash out rashly. I needed a methodical approach. So I left, my footsteps crunching on the gravel as I returned to my truck. I spent a sleepless night in my study, poring over the county's land records. I triple-checked my deeds, verifying the boundaries. The entire lake, plus a half-mile radius around it, was undeniably mine. And by mine, I mean I personally owned it, or one of my real estate holding companies did. Miss Connolly's claims about an extended HOA boundary had no legal standing. If she tried to twist the records, she'd be in for a rude awakening. Early the next morning, I phoned a friend, attorney James Whitaker, who specialized in property disputes. We'd grown up together, and though he'd moved to Atlanta, he was always happy to help me out, especially for a chance to bring down an overzealous HOA. He told me I could easily file a trespassing complaint, but if the HOA was forging documents or misrepresenting boundaries, we might have a bigger case. We could also consider environmental or safety violations, he said. Those torches near the water, any damage to fish or wildlife, you might have grounds for serious fines. I liked that angle. People sometimes forget that a lake has an ecosystem. Bonfires, waste disposal, messing with the shoreline, these can all breach county or state environmental regulations. And if you own the entire county, like me, well, not literally every square mile, but effectively the majority of private land near the lake, there's a lot of leverage to be had. I quietly hold seats on various local boards, though I rarely show up or vote. Miss Connolly clearly had no idea about my network of influence. Around noon, I headed back to the lake. The aftermath of the luau was plain to see. Empty cups, soggy leis, half-burned tiki torches, scraps of food. A cluster of volunteers in Lakecrest t-shirts scurried around trying to clean up. I flagged down one older gentleman who seemed to be supervising. "Where's Ms. Connolly?" I asked. He eyed me warily. She said she'd be here soon. I waited by the water's edge, studying the battered shoreline. Bits of broken glass glinted in the shallows. Someone had driven wooden stakes into the sand to anchor a makeshift stage. The stage was gone now, but the holes remained. A wave of anger rose in my gut. These people had treated my lake as if it were a public park they could trash at will. Finally, Miss Connolly arrived, stepping out of a sleek white SUV. She wore a crisp blouse and slacks this time, her expression all business. "Mr. Pierce," she greeted me, forcing a polite smile. "I trust you slept well after letting us finish the event?" I took a measured breath. "I did not sleep well, Miss Connolly, but I have a few things to discuss with you. Let's start with your blatant trespassing and potential environmental damage," she tisked, glancing at the volunteers. "We're cleaning up. The HOA is well within its rights to host events for the community. Our updated map—" I cut her off. "There is no updated map that overrides my deed, Miss Connolly. I've checked thoroughly. Either you fabricated something, or you're severely mistaken. Either way, we have a problem." Her eyes flashed with annoyance. "I'm sure we can come to an arrangement. Perhaps we pay you a small rental fee for last night? The association's budget can handle that." I almost laughed. A small fee won't fix the damage done, nor the principle of the matter. I told you plainly last year that you have no right to this property, yet you marched in here with torches, music, and a crowd of people. She attempted a dismissive shrug. "It's just a few families enjoying the lake. Let's not blow this out of proportion." But I was done playing nice. I gestured to the water. "You call scorching the shoreline and littering plastic lays into the lake a few families enjoying the water? I have pictures of last night's fiasco. My lawyer is preparing legal actions as we speak." Her face paled slightly, though she tried to hide it. "Mr. Pierce, the Lake Crest community stands behind me. We have a strong legal team too. I doubt your threats will go anywhere." I gave a slow nod, letting her think what she wanted. "All right, Ms. Connolly. Remember those words when the fines start rolling in." She stormed off, barking orders at the volunteers to pick up every last scrap. But as she left, she shot me a look that said, "You haven't seen the last of me." I spent the rest of the day coordinating with my attorney, James. We considered multiple angles. Trespassing, clear evidence. We had photos from last night, plus eyewitness accounts, plus Miss Connolly's own admission that the HOA planned the event. Environmental damage. The local Environmental Protection Office might be interested in the tiki torches, the potential runoff from the large-scale cooking, and the leftover trash. County zoning violations. If they built anything on my land, even a temporary stage, that might require a permit. I also had a conversation with the local sheriff, a good friend of my father's. He wasn't thrilled about stepping into an HOA dispute, but he recognized my documented land ownership. "If you want me to file official trespassing charges, I can," he said. I told him to hold off for the moment. I wanted to see if Ms. Connolly would come to her senses, or if we'd have to teach her a more thorough lesson. A day later, I received a letter from Lake Crest HOA's legal counsel claiming they had prescriptive rights to the lakefront, referencing an old handshake deal from decades ago. I rolled my eyes. If they'd had valid claims, they'd have presented them in official form before. This reeked of Miss Connolly rummaging through the files for any excuse. James and I responded with a formal cease and desist notice, plus a draft of the fine schedule we intended to pursue. See, in this county, if you degrade private shoreline or set up an event without a permit, you can face daily fines that add up quickly. And that was just the start. What Ms. Connolly and her cronies didn't know was that I also had a seat, albeit rarely exercised, on the county board that oversees local environmental compliance. My father had that seat first, and after he passed, I inherited it. I rarely use that power, preferring to let the board function without me, but this situation demanded some involvement. When the next board meeting convened, I showed up unannounced. Miss Connolly was there, presumably thinking she'd sweet-talk the board into ignoring any complaints. Her eyes bulged when she saw me. The board recognized me, of course. One member, Mr. Caldwell, greeted me with a polite nod. "Mr. Pierce, it's good to see you again. We're discussing an alleged violation at the lake." I calmly presented the evidence. Photos of the luau, the unauthorized structures, the fireworks residue in the water, yes, they had a small fireworks show, and the leftover debris that volunteers didn't fully remove. Then, I laid out the official property lines proving my ownership. Ms. Connolly tried to interject, stammering about community tradition and public good, but I countered that Lakecrest is a private HOA, not a public entity, and they had no right to hijack my land. Mr. Caldwell sighed heavily. "Ms. Connolly, you're aware that events on private shoreline require permits and the property owner's consent?" She tried to dodge, but the board wasn't buying it. Another member chimed in about water contamination from the luau's cooking oils. The tension in the room soared. Before the meeting ended, the board voted to investigate Lakecrest HOA for potential violations. Miss Conley's face was a storm cloud. She marched out, ignoring me, but not before I caught a glimpse of raw fury in her eyes. I braced for retaliation. Sure enough, the next day Miss Connolly circulated a newsletter among Lakecrest residents, painting me as a land baron who wanted to deprive the community of lake access. She conveniently omitted the fact that the lake was never in their domain to begin with. She urged residents to stand united against intimidation, probably hoping they'd mount some campaign to pressure me. But Miss Connolly had no clue about the extent of my holdings or relationships in the county. Residents can't intimidate me if half of them are unknowingly renting from a property management firm I own. Over the years, I'd quietly acquired multiple houses and lots in Lakecrest, renting them out under neutral-sounding LLCs. Once that detail became known, it would flip the narrative fast. While Miss Connolly tried to rally her troops, the county's environmental compliance officer slapped Lakecrest HOA with an initial set of fines for unauthorized shoreline alteration. The sum wasn't massive, but it was enough to sting. I heard that Miss Connolly scrambled to call an emergency board meeting, claiming she had no idea the penalties would be so severe. Feeling bold, I decided to crash that HOA meeting. They held it in the Lakecrest Community Clubhouse, a fancy building with big windows and an echoing foyer. Residents filtered in, many looking anxious or confused. When Miss Connolly saw me at the door, she nearly choked on her own breath, but she couldn't legally bar me since the meeting was technically open to Lakecrest property holders, and, ironically, I owned a few properties right there. As the meeting got underway, Ms. Connolly tried to brush aside the fines as a misunderstanding, saying the HOA legal team would fight them. But one resident stood up, voice trembling with anger. "You said it was safe to host that luau there. Now we're all facing fines and could see our HOA dues go up. Where's your proof that we had rights to the lake?" Ms. Connolly sputtered something about old county maps. I raised my hand calmly, with no choice. Miss Connolly let me speak. "Folks, I understand you're upset. But Miss Connolly never had a valid claim to my land. I warned her last year, she ignored me, and now you're stuck with the bills. I don't want to see honest residents paying for her mistake." A murmur spread through the room. Another homeowner asked, "Is it true you own most of the land around here, or is that just a rumor?" I shrugged. "Call it a rumor with substantial evidence. I hold the deeds to the lakefront and other parcels in this county. I've never exploited that ownership, until now. But if Ms. Connolly insists on pushing false claims, the county board is well within its rights to impose more fines. Or worse." Ms. Connolly bristled. "This is a scare tactic," she snapped. "We won't be bullied. The Lakecrest HOA stands united." But the mood had shifted. Several residents glared at her. Some whispered that she'd tricked them into thinking the lake was partially theirs. Others demanded an explanation for the mounting legal fees. I realized Ms. Connolly's power base was cracking. A few days later, the county board's official inspection came back with a list of violations. Unpermitted bonfires close to the water, risking contamination and safety hazards. Temporary structures built without shoreline permits. Unauthorized large-scale gathering without liability coverage for a private lake. Each violation carried potential daily fines. Ms. Connolly and the HOA faced thousands of dollars in penalties if they didn't settle quickly. The local newspaper got wind of the fiasco, printing an article titled, "Luau on Wrong Shore Leaves HOA in Hot Water." The piece featured quotes from me and a few outraged residents. Sensing the tide turning, Ms. Connolly changed tactics. Reaching out to me privately, she emailed a polite request for a productive conversation to resolve differences. I wasn't naive, but I agreed to meet, hoping to settle matters without prolonged legal warfare. We scheduled a sit-down at a local cafe. She arrived in a tailored suit, wearing a forced smile. "Mr. Pierce, I'm sure we can find a mutual solution." Her eyes flickered with a mix of desperation and leftover resentment. I sipped my coffee. "What solution did you have in mind?" She sighed, leaning in. "Look, the association can't afford massive fines. Our residents will rebel if dues skyrocket. We're prepared to pay a reasonable settlement for that luau, perhaps a one-time fee or a lease for future events. We can negotiate." I studied her carefully. "Miss Connolly, you have no right to my land. I'm not interested in leasing the lake to Lakecrest. The damage is done. My lawyer is drafting a final settlement demand, covering the environmental penalties, plus compensation for the trespassing." She inhaled sharply. "That could bankrupt us. Lakecrest HOA isn't a big corporation. The residents are regular families." I let her words linger. My sense of fairness told me these families, many of whom had no clue about the illegal luau, shouldn't suffer too much. But Miss Connolly needed to learn a lesson, and I refused to let her off scot-free. "I'll consider reducing certain penalties if you resign from the HOA presidency," I said quietly. Her face went rigid. "That's blackmail." I shrugged. "Call it what you want. I don't trust you to run that association after what I've seen. Step down, publicly apologize for the trespass, and maybe I'll talk to the county board about reducing some fines." She glared, hands trembling around her coffee cup. "This is outrageous." "Is it?" I retorted. "You threw a massive luau on property that wasn't yours, you misled an entire community, and now you're drowning in fines. If that's not outrageous, I don't know what is." Her gaze lowered. "You'll ruin me." I almost felt a pang of sympathy, but I reminded myself how she brazenly disrespected my father's land. "You ruined yourself by biting off more than you could chew," I replied softly. We ended the meeting at an impasse. Over the next few days, rumors swirled that Miss Connolly was fighting to keep her position, but the residents had grown restless, demanding transparency about the HOA finances, the cost of potential legal battles, and the daily fines piling up. A local TV station even did a short segment titled, "Lake Luau Leaves HOA in the Red." The final blow came when the county board escalated the penalties, citing Ms. Connolly's refusal to comply. The total soared into tens of thousands. Lakecrest's reserve fund was nowhere near enough. A second emergency HOA meeting was called, at which Ms. Connolly tried to rally supporters by accusing me of landlord tyranny. But it backfired. Residents just wanted the fines to stop. They saw that Ms. Connolly had no plan except to keep fighting a losing battle. Under mounting pressure, she caved, announcing her resignation effective immediately. I watched footage of that meeting recorded on a neighbor's phone. Ms. Connolly looked defeated, her voice shaking as she read a prepared statement. "I take responsibility for the confusion regarding the lake event. Effective today, I step down." The camera panned to show relief and frustration in equal measure among the attendees. She ended by apologizing to all Lakecrest residents for any financial hardship, but she never mentioned me by name. The new HOA leadership reached out promptly, wanting to settle the matter. I agreed to a meeting with them, without Miss Connolly present. They humbly apologized, offered to pay a fair settlement out of the association's reserves, and asked me to petition the county board to reduce or waive some of the environmental fines. After some negotiation, I agreed. My main goal was to ensure no repeat trespasses and to get Miss Connolly out of power. I went before the county board and stated that Lakecrest's new administration was cooperative and remorseful. I recommended a partial reduction in the fines, provided the HOA followed strict guidelines for any future gatherings. The board, trusting my judgment and seeing Miss Connolly's downfall, softened the penalties. In the end, the HOA still faced a hefty bill, but it was manageable, enough to drive home the lesson, but not bankrupt them. As for Miss Connolly, she vanished from public life for a while. Some said she might move to a different development, start fresh. Others claimed she was too embarrassed to show her face. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she tried to sue me personally for emotional distress, but no lawyer would take the case. The county crackdown also served as a warning to other HOAs that might get too big for their britches. My father's land and the rest of my properties remained secure. The local press turned the fiasco into a cautionary tale. Don't assume the shore is yours if Joshua Pierce owns it. A bit dramatic, but it deterred any future stunts. On a quiet evening a month later, I strolled along the lakeshore, the same spot where torches once burned for that ill-fated luau. A gentle breeze rustled the reeds. I noticed how quickly the environment recovers when left undisturbed. The footprints and broken glass had been cleaned up, the water shimmering under a golden sunset. My phone buzzed, a text from the new HOA president confirming they'd transferred the final settlement payment. I typed back a polite acknowledgement. Then I stood there, gazing across the still water, thinking of my father. He would have approved of how I handled Miss Connolly. Firm, but fair enough not to crush the entire community. And so the fiasco ended with Lakecrest leadership overhauled, Miss Connolly dethroned, and the entire county learning that no matter how confident an HOA might be, messing with a property owner who literally controls the land is a losing proposition. As for me, I remain the quiet presence who chooses not to flaunt his vast ownership until someone tries to bully or trespass. That's when they discover the truth. I don't just own a lake, I practically own the entire county, and if you cross the line, you'll find yourself drowning in fines.